a whole lot of beautiful individuals that Dee will talk to during her presentation later on. I just, of course, want to say good morning, but also say to some of our other people whose first language is not English, and I hope I can get this right. Sani Bonani, Giana, Mokela, Assalamu alaikum, Hoyamora, good morning. And a very, very warm welcome to all of you who have registered and who are joining through the link that was sent to you a week or two ago. We are also very excited that for the first time, we are joined by 2 sign language interpreters with the compliments of Deaf South Africa. We're very, very grateful that they are joining us today. It is a very busy time, and as we try and wrap up what has been another very daunting year for most of us, a year that was filled with tremendous challenges, which will, I think some of us have felt it already, ultimately impact on the sustainability of organizations in the sector and therefore on the sector itself. You know, the sector looks after communities, and in the last little while, these communities have become fairly reliant and dependent on the work that we do, and particularly as a result of the pandemic, as I said. And then at the same time, you know, we're having to deal with issues there's social issues, environmental issues, and ethical issues. And so it's been a really, really difficult year. So the intention of this public meeting is to share with you what the members of the nonprofit working group have been working on, and also that work that we've taken on board as a team. We're all volunteers and we represent organizations across, I would like to believe, the length and breadth of South Africa. And we will share with you the outcome of a mapping exercise today as well that we attempted over the last little while. And it's just to get a better understanding of exactly who are we representing. Because we have these meetings, these public meetings with organizations and representatives of organizations, and you know, there's pop here. We have to make sure we protect information. People don't provide all the information, so that we're not very clear always who are in the room with us. And we realize that things have moved quite fast, and perhaps not everyone has had the interest or the opportunity to understand the impact of the proposed Amendment Act, or NPO Act Amendment Bill. So the working group have been very fortunate to have in our corner Nicole Copley and her team from NGO Law, who have put in an enormous amount of hours making sense of the issues, sharing and preparing submissions with the support of working group members. And some days were tough, I must say. Some days were tough as we tried to fit in all of this into the normal workday. And you know, some of us have day jobs, which includes nights. And then we're all, just a reminder, we're all volunteering. We're all volunteering ourselves, our time, our resources to make sure that we make an impact and really get our voices out there, and we need your help. And so it's absolutely fantastic that you have joined us today, because we need more voices. We have conducted a short survey, and this sample is obviously representative of those who have registered. I'll talk a little bit later. And then I'm just going to quickly tell you before we start, I wanted to welcome you, of course. But before we start, we are going to talk to you about the way that you can navigate yourself today in terms of access to mics. And then if the opportunity arises for you to speak, I'd like to ask you very, very kindly to, as the day or the 2 hours proceed, for you to put your questions as it comes up for you in the chat. We have 2 individuals, Anne Bown and Jenny Wright, who's going to attempt to respond in the moment. Then we have Jocelyn who is going to keep an eye on the questions and alert us that there are these questions. If we aren't able to respond to these questions, we will take it to a plenary when we have a break. We will, or after every session, or we could just see how the day goes, and try and address those. But we would like to do all of that in the 2 hours that we have. So then, just as a further intro, over the course of 13 months, the working group have engaged fairly extensively. What you have seen in our communiques is the result of all that hours of work that's been put in. We have had various touch points as well with parliamentary groupings, the Department of Social Development and the NPO Directorate, and members and peer groups. And of course, there are other groupings who are involved in similar type of work, and in some instances, they've reached out to us. We've reached out to them. We know who's doing what. We've met them at the different forums. We've made new friends during the process, and perhaps individuals we can't quite call our friends yet, but we're working towards that. But we certainly have not cultivated any enemies, that I can assure you. And so we're in a pretty good space. We've all learned so much, and we are absolutely clear about why we exist, what we need to do, and what we need to continue to do. Again, I want to ask you for your help in helping us with this. So the 2 hours will run as follows. I'm going to quickly go to the, sorry about that. I'm going to skip over the other slides quickly just to show you the program, and then we'll go back to that. So this is how the 2 hours will unfold. There's the welcome and introductions, and I'm busy wrapping up now. Then Dean Moskoff will present to us. It's just an update on the kind of work that we've done since October 2021. And then Nicole Copley will join us, and she'll take us through the various acts or various amendments that was done to those 2 bills. And then Ricardo Weingart will join us, and he'll take us through some insights that he will give us in terms of risks to our boards. And it's not something that we have maybe taken back to boards. And so it's very, very important that, you know, we take information back to them. And then the last presentation will be, the penultimate presentation will be provided by Fatima Shabadin, who's been very kind to make herself available to us. She'll talk about the amendments, how it impacts on grant makers, and also subsequently on the sector. And then we will go to close out to a bit of Q&A. But in between this, we're going to do a poll as well. Going to be 3 questions that we would ask you, please, to complete, and it will just help us to gather more information. When we get to those points, of course, I will talk to that. So thank you for that. I'm going to go back now to hand over to Jacques so that he can talk to you about housekeeping.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Ferial. Yes, folks, so the idea for this session is just to give you an guideline to get the best experience out of the way that we're going to be setting this up for today. So please take note of the following. We will have interpreters that will be sharing the screen with you today. I will later show you how to just set it up so that you only see screens of people who the video is switched on for. Please remember to post all those questions in the text box. At the end of the webinar, we will do a Q&A. We're also going to be running a poll a little bit later. And of course, please note this meeting is being recorded. You would have received a notification, and you would have been able to just accept it. Here we go. Ferry, if you can go take us to the next. Here we go. So first, I have to ask to make sure that everything runs as smooth as possible, to make sure that your speakers are switched on your side, but more importantly, that the microphone and the video is switched off, so that we don't have you popping up in the middle of, where people are presenting, and we just want to make sure that the rest of the participants has the clearer view. So what you can do is at the bottom of your screens, you will see there is a mute button and a start-stop video button. You can just click on it, and if there's a red line through it, it means it's definitely switched off. If you can go to the next one. Okay, yes, and that's where that's the start stop. So yes, so what we'll do is on that button, you'll see there's a little arrow pointing up right to the right of it. And if you click on that one, if you can just if you can click for me for the next one, you'll see you'll get video settings. And on those video settings, if you click on video settings, it will open up a menu for you. If you can go to the next one for me. There we go. And that menu, in that menu, one of the ones that you can tick will be hide non-video participants. And that is just so that we can clear up the screen of anybody's video who's not switched on. And like we said, we only want to have the video switched on of the people presenting and, of course, our interpreters. Then, Farrell, if you can take us to the next one. Closed captions. Now, I know that not all Zoom systems have this. It's on certain packages and certain packages don't. But if you do, you can just look at the bottom of your screen. You can just if you can click that one for me again, you will see right at the bottom, right next to your breakout rooms and all the other, there you have one that will show show captions, or it will show hide captions. And if you click on it, you should be able to see the transcription and captions for it. But like I say, that only works on certain systems. And there we go. That's it from me. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacques, for that. As I said, we are going to commence now, and we will be handing you over to Dee in Moscow, who's going to talk very succinctly about the activities of the working group over a little while. So let me go there. You're on mute.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good morning. This session is ready to update you on the progress of the NPO Working Group, how it has represented you, the NPO sector, over the past year. And so we'll start with how it all started. The NPO Directorate under the Department of Social Development published a call for comments on the Non-Profit Amendment Bill 2018 on the 5th of October. You're moving the slides too fast. Can you go back to the one before? Thanks. Thank you. So the NPO Directorate under DSD published a call for comments on the NPO Amendment Bill 2018 on 5th of October last year, with 30th of October being a final date for submission of comments. So the purpose of the amendment bill is noted in this preamble of the actual bill, which is to amend the Non-Profit Organizations Act 1997 so as to amend and insert certain definitions to provide the Office of the Registrar of Non-Profit Organizations, to provide the registration of non-profit organizations and compulsory registration of foreign organizations, and to provide the arbitration tribunal for the disputes resolution, and to provide for matters connected to that. And then what happened is this was published, and Inyatelo, the South African Institute for Advancement, was alerted by a colleague in the sector to a call for comment on what she described the bill as clumsily drafted with mysterious provisions and not supported by an explanatory memo. And then go to the next slide. Thank you. On 5th of October 21, DSD called for public comment, and then Inyatelo then called an NPO sector-wide meeting, thereby issuing an invitation via social media, national network organizations, and convened a webinar on Thursday, the 21st of October. This was to unpack fundamental changes proposed in the NPO Amendment Bill and the lack of an explanatory memorandum. This meeting was attended by 170 NPOs, of which many of you were part of across the country and representing various sectors. Out of that, a representative NPO working group was nominated for an NPO sector response at this meeting. Is someone else? Am I going too fast? Enya Taylor agreed to facilitate the process, and this included convening meetings, hosting a page on their website, and to keep the public updated and informed. And I hope you've all been accessing that. Importantly to note that the 170 organizations who were on that call represent a further estimate of more than 10,000 NGOs across the Republic of South Africa, and representing, again, large national organizations to smaller CBOs spanning the full spectrum of registrations, being VAs, MPCs, and trusts. And then on 5th of October, and then what is the mandate of the NPO working group? And our mandate is really to give a voice on legislation for sector sustainability. So the NPO Amendment Bill initiated the whole process, and we agreed that a framework is needed for an NPO policy that will adapt to meet sector resilience in order to mitigate disasters, climate change, unforeseen funding drifts, governance and compliance challenges, and anything else really that affects the sector from a legislation perspective. How do we achieve this? We achieve it through public discussion, public discussion, debate, and consultation via webinars like this, media awareness through our partnerships with the media houses, lobbying on public policy through public participation opportunities, which Nicole will speak to, and then sharing actions and outcomes by preparing submissions and position statements. So all of this is done by the working group on behalf of all of you. So who are the nominated working group members that were nominated on the 21st of October? There are 16 of us. And the list here is Anne, Boichoko, Colleen, all of them, you can read them. But importantly to note that the working group have a broad mix of skill and experience, with only a few of us having had experience in public sector advocacy. So just building off what Ferial said in the introduction, is for everyone here, we have other jobs, and everyone on this team is doing this in their extra time after hours and in between hours. So we really are a volunteer group of people who have been nominated and have taken this seriously. Slide number 6, please. And this is the slide that I want to bring your attention and focus to. It's a snapshot of the timeline of things as they've unfolded and how the group have responded on your behalf. I won't go through each step, as that's happening in the next session. Nicole will share with you in more detail the content of what happened. But things to bring to your attention here. So if you follow from the top left, green, the 5th of October 21 being the thing that activated this whole response, through to, just follow the black line as you read through it. Things to bring to your attention here are the tight deadlines between 5th of October and 30th of October, with DSD releasing their explanatory memorandum only on the 25th of October, with the tight deadline to 30th of October due to the due date for submissions. So there you can see very, very tight deadlines. We had to act quickly, having the public webinar, appointing a working group, organizing ourselves very quickly, and then speaking to what the issues were. So the drawn out responses to our request for extension, between which time we sent further letters to request withdrawal of the bill altogether. So if you look at 30th of October due date for submissions, and on the 31st, the working group requested an extension for submission. If you follow the black line, you'll see that only in June, in May, the deadline for public comment was gazetted, and it was extended by the 10th of June. So you can see very quick deadlines and then very long responses, which were drawn out. Eventually by May, the deadline for public comment was gazetted with an extension to 10th of June. And then if you see from 31st of October, when extension, sorry, I'm following my notes. During which time we ran a public campaign to lobby support for removal of the amendment bill. And then later on in August, all of a sudden a presidential summit was held. Again, very short notice. We only had 6 days notice. The NPO sector was not widely represented, and that became a whole story on its own. And separately and unrelated to the NPO Act Amendment Bill, you'll see this year suddenly we go blue because a new law, a bill flies into the arena, and that's the general law bill enters. So it kind of threw us a little bit off key, because we didn't expect this, and we had to recalibrate and respond very quickly again to that. And then on 19th of October, suddenly the NPO Directorate posted a revised memorandum on the amendment bill, so they appear again. You'll see everything NPO Directorate is green and General Law Bill is blue. 21st of October, the NPO Working Group requests that the NPO Directorate now gets removed from DSD due to lack of capacity and resources of the DSD. As you can see throughout the green line process, there was evidence of just lack of capacity there. So currently there are further in-depth engagements regarding the General Laws Bill, and it's ongoing as we speak. I think tomorrow there's another meeting, and things are unfolding in that arena. So what we want to bring to your attention is appreciation for the depth of attention required by working group members to navigate this unpredictable roadmap of this process. And also to note that Inyatelo have published 17 communiques. It's all on their website to keep the sector abreast of each stage as it's unfolded. And we've also published 7 media releases, and we've run the one campaign to lobby support for the withdrawal of the NPO Amendment Bill. So I'm out of breath, as I hope you all are too, because it's been a busy year all round, and I think that we can applaud this working group for the incredible work they've done on behalf of the civil society sector at large. So what's next? We need to keep monitoring, that's the next slide, keep monitoring and campaigning for action on the NPO Amendment Bill in early 23, hopefully if we get no surprises over the holiday season. And the independence of the NPO Directorate from DSD, again, Nicole will speak to that. We need to keep talking to the Financial Action Task Force, Treasury, FIX, SARS, and EU Global. We at-risk NPOs, again, you'll hear about that later on. We need to keep raising awareness through media, coalitions, and partnerships, and we need to keep asking questions and keeping our ear to the ground. Thank you very much, and I hope that this has enlightened you to the work of the NPO Working Group.
Thanks very much, Dee. You're right, you know, I too was out of breath as you were talking. So it is a huge amount of work, very, very commendable. So great that you provided that overview of the activities over the past, I think it's about 13 months since October 2021. So just also as, so that I can tell everyone, the presentations that we are delivering today will be, whichever presentations are made available to us, will be available on the amendment, the little mini website that we have, and on the Inyatelo main website, and you will find other useful information there as well. And I'm sure it will bring you fully up to speed with whatever we are dealing with. If you haven't been part of things up until now, I guarantee you there's enough information to sort of make you very excited about how things have progressed. The different bills that are being amended, there's information there, and then how it's impacting on the sector. Nicole will talk to that now. And so on that note, I would like to welcome Nicole Copley. As I mentioned before, just want to make sure that I get to the next slide. As I mentioned before, really Nicole has been handling the lion's share of the work and preparing submissions and presentations on behalf of the NPO Working Group. So on that note, Nicole, over to you. You may share your presentation.
And here is my voice. Can you all see? Thanks for that intro. I'm not seeing anybody saying they can't see, and of course I can only see the hello sign language interpreter.
All good.
All
Hi,
good.
Nicole.
Okay.
Nicole, can you give us a second quickly? Nicole, can you give us a
Sure.
second just to spotlight your video?
Thank you. No worries.
There we go. Hi, folks. If you are set on side-by-side gallery, all the view should be good.
Great. Thank you. Can I proceed, Jacques? Good. Okay. Thank you, Jenny, Dee, for that update. And I liked your timeline. I wanted one that looked like that. You'll see mine looks a little more boring. I've been given the rather large task of summarizing and bringing us up to date with a whole lot of complicated and actually sometimes quite mind-numbingly boring details of amendments to bills and processes. Forgive a bit of a high-speed dash through it. I'm going to try and not send you to sleep with all the details. You're going to get the highlights real, and hopefully in a way that's useful to you. Just in terms of, and this is, and I'm not going to read them through because Dee has covered a whole lot of this. So this is my, from the lawyer's side, summary of the various stages and dates that we've gone through. And you'll see there's been meeting after meeting and deadlines for submissions and all you know, one thing after another. As Dee has explained, we were asked, and I know Dee has highlighted the tight deadlines, and you'll see this summary also just clearly displays that. And we were actually asked in our last meeting but one with the National Council of Provinces, and the chair, Eunice Karim, praised our presentations and then said, you've done such a good job. Why are you complaining about having such a short amount of time? Because you've obviously had enough time to do a good job. What would you have done with more time? And I think on reflection, my answer to the somewhat cheeky question is, number one, perhaps we would have neglected our day jobs less and actually not neglected our clients quite so much. And number two, and more importantly, much more engagement. So with the time that we had and the connections that we had, we reached out and we got as many people into the room, and we tried to explain it to as many people and get as many people engaged in it. But I'm still day to day coming across nonprofits who have never heard of any of this yet, which is worrying to me. So we need to make the circle bigger. Okay, so here we go. So some of this comes off slides that we've shared. So for instance, in the past, and this is something I've shared with this group in the past, and we shared with the various government parliamentary bodies we've negotiated with, just explaining to them what the sector looks like and what we've got at the moment. And then the NPO Directorate and what that kind of registration actually is, which we found a lot of people didn't really understand. And also in this black box, most importantly, how the NPO Directorate, where it currently sits as a sub-department inside of DSD, is severely undercapacitated. It can't, as we all know, carry on its current functions. Its register is about 10 years out of date already. And so it was, that's one of the reasons, as you know, we all went into a flurry and a state of shock, and hell no, this can't happen, when it looked like there was going to be mandatory registration for every single nonprofit in the country of every kind, under first the NPO bill and then under this new General Laws Amendment Bill. So just looking back, Dee has already mentioned the October 2021 surprise NPO bill that came out. It was a surprise to us, even though it had a 2018 date on it. That NPO Amendment Bill, which was end of last year, was an attempt to preempt actually these FATF requirements, an attempt to reposition the directorate by redefining it, and also to enable kind of levels of compliance with nonprofit organizations, to allow for different sizes and different sorts of organization. So the highlights reel of what that bill did was it was making NPO registration compulsory for every organization, including foreign nonprofits which were operating undefined. It also waded in banning registrations of organizations with identical names, despite the fact that there are loads of organizations already registered with identical names, effectively making a minimum of 6 on boards and adding a mystery prescribed details and reporting requirements. As you'd already have seen, there was a call to arms, there was a public process, and there was a campaign. And in the face of this vigorous opposition, this NPO Amendment Bill stood down at that stage, and everything went quiet on us. Then along came FATF. Of course, FATF had been lurking in the shadows all along, but unbeknownst to those of us who weren't paying attention. And the goals, I'm not going to read all the things on the screen because many of you are now, I think, familiar with this, it's around combating money laundering and terrorist financing, and also and they do this by a provision which is grey listing countries. And so it's not non-profit sectors just being targeted, but entire countries that they assess. And they set standards, and the idea is to encourage changes in countries to combat financial crimes, terrorism, human trafficking, illegal trading. And then this is just a very brief summary of the kind of greatest hits of what we've come to call the Octopus Bill. The Octopus Bill because it tried to change so many acts all at once. It's a General Laws Amendment Bill. One of the main aims of this bill is to expose what in the act, these various acts, is called beneficial owners. Now, beneficial owners doesn't sit well with any of us in the nonprofit sector because we know that nobody owns anything. But when it comes to the nonprofit sector, they're intending to look at people who ultimately control organizations, the people at the very bottom. And the other thing that the first draft of the bill did was, sorry, I'm interrupting myself here. There's somebody with a mic on with a noise in the background. If you could mute whoever's in charge of that. Thank you. Okay, so this first draft of the bill also made NPO registration compulsory for every organization. And one of the other important things is that it codified and made consistent across all of the acts offences which people had committed, which would then make it impossible for them to hold office on various boards. Okay, so our response to it, and it was an urgent response, and this you will be familiar with already, was the fact that there is international donor funding that was at risk if we were grey listed. Also, of course, the wider negative economic impact associated with grey listing would also have a major impact on the nonprofit sector. Our feeling, and it's the feeling in rooms in general, has been that in fact it's the nonprofit sector that gets hit hardest and gets hit first by this kind of grey listing provision. So the decision was made that we couldn't, as we had with the NPO Amendment Bill, just reject this bill out of hand, because in order to avoid the grey listing, these changes some changes need to be made. But we went into the room and made submissions on changes that we thought were more sensible and more appropriate, so that the grey listing could be avoided and the donor funding could still flow. Of course, all of our efforts and all of the efforts of Treasury don't guarantee that grey listing will be avoided. There are various levels and things that are measured by the FATF, and legislation is not the only one. The other thing we've said in all of these rooms is that we're not against transparency, accountability, good governance, improved governance in the nonprofit sector, but that we're against being forced into these things in ways which are not suitable and in ways which are not consultative and without a general and a broad plan. And that there wasn't time in the short space provided for us to actually be able to rally the whole of the sector and go through a proper planning process for these kinds of things. Okay, so these are just some excerpts from some of the submissions that we made. So when we looked at the FATF requirements, one of the things that we tried to explain very clearly was that it wasn't just what you put in the bills and the legislation that FATF is going to look at, but actually whether you're implementing it on the ground. And based upon that, our submission is that the Nonprofit Directorate would not be capable of actually registering all of the nonprofit organizations in South Africa. And if it did have to register all of the nonprofit organizations in South Africa, the directorate would probably break in the process. And also that, so it just wasn't sensible. And so this is, so our submission in those sectors was that if they enforced mandatory universal NPO registration, the nonprofit sector would reject the bill, and then in effect South Africa would fail the effectiveness of implementation tests. So one of the things we did in those processes was that we drew attention to the actual FATF recommendations on the nonprofit sector. And in fact, the FATF doesn't recommend that every single organization in every country has to be registered. It has a functional definition, which is and it focuses upon organizations which they think are most at risk of being abused for money laundering or terrorist financing or other sorts of fraud. And these slides and definitions come from FATF recommendation number 8. And so we made submissions on this basis. The summary of what occurred through that is that we were heard. The Treasury and the others involved in the drafting of this bill were convinced, in fact, to switch from mandatory universal registration of all nonprofits to a risk-based approach of nonprofits instead of mandatory registration. So to use the term of phrase we're using, no knitting clubs need to register. There was a more tailored approach to what they call beneficial ownership, and consideration has been given to privacy rights. However, the timing of this is all still skewed because there are ongoing parallel assessment and risk and scanning processes of the nonprofit sector, which really should have happened first. And the other thing is that despite our detailed submissions on the DSD being an inappropriate place for a wider NPO registry and also for oversight of these sorts of things that are required by FATF, there wasn't an easy fix in this bill and in this time period, and so that is currently still sitting with the NPO Directorate, which is still, as we all know, inside of DSD. So just to give you the bottom line in terms of the major changes of what the Octopus Bill in its current form, and as Dee has said, there are some ongoing negotiations and meetings, but they're kind of getting to the end now, and more nonprofits have said what they've got to say and have been heard and are dropping out of these engagements. And I kind of think that the version of the bill that is the amended version of the bill is going to be what's going to go through. So the 3 high points here is that, as we've already mentioned, there's an alignment between the various acts in terms of disqualifications for fraud, dishonesty, and money laundering, counter-terrorist financing. And there's a mechanism which we don't think will be very practically implementable at the moment, in terms of which people who are convicted of the range of offences that are listed are meant to then be removed from office as on committees or boards or as trustees or directors of nonprofits. And that there's meant to be a notification process coming from the Department of Justice to the various registry authorities, and then they will say, the Master of the High Court, for instance, is meant to say, oh, all these trustees are not allowed to serve as trusts. We all know that the Master of the High Court doesn't actually have a database that allows them to currently search for those kinds of details. So there we are, practical requirements. Just getting to compulsory NPO registration and where it now sits. So this is the second blue part in the slide. As it is in the bill in its current form, it is only organizations which make donations to individuals or organizations outside of the Republic borders or provide humanitarian, religious, charitable, educational, cultural services out of South Africa's borders, which will be required compulsory now to register with the nonprofit directorate. So that is a significant shrink from the initial everybody must register. It's a focused risk-based thing in that Treasury and the others said that this was what they were particularly worried about, was where there was a cross-border flow of funds, and that was what needed to be monitored. So that's where that came down to. Another important thing to bear in mind is that there's prescribed information that now needs to be kept up to date and reported on in various contexts. And that relates to the beneficial ownership, or as we've already said, people ultimately in control. And that's why that is there. Okay, so practical recommendations, and I think Ricardo is going to speak to some of this shortly. So every organization should have a risk register, and the boards of every organization should be looking at what are the risks that organization faces and what will it do to mitigate those risks. And just our recommendation is that one adds to that list looking at potential abuse for fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing. The other thing that organizations are going to have to do as a routine thing from now on is to have a close look at the sorts of offences that people are not, that disable people and disqualify people from serving on boards of any non-profits now, trusts, NPCs, voluntary associations, and that the background checks will have to be conducted and on new incoming and then people who will be on those boards. If organizations have a membership base, so voluntary associations or non-profit companies that have members, they need to have an update, and this has always been the case, but now there's an added incentive to do so because you might need to report on it. Who are the actual people who are the members? And then also if the organization has other organizations, for instance, which have certain powers. So often one sees an organization where another organization has the power to appoint 1 or 2 people to serve on its board. Those sorts of appointment, and sometimes there are veto powers, will also need to be kept in a register somewhere, listed and reported on if necessary. If the organization which you serve has projects or beneficiaries which lie outside the boundaries of South Africa, and the organization is not yet registered as a non-profit organization, we suggest that you make an application now. And we suggest that you make an application now because we think there's going to be an influx once it actually lands. And so we're predicting that this will happen. If your organization is already registered as a non-profit organization, and you're one of those many organizations who are behind with their non-profit, their NPO annual reports because nobody's noticed or done anything about it for the last 10 years, get those NPO reports up to date, because my feeling is that in order for the non-profit organizations director to get functioning and to get fit in order to take on these mandatory registrations and to do the oversight, they do finally actually have to clean up the non-profit organizations register of non-compliant organizations and roll out their plan which was delayed by COVID and then other factors. My prediction is that that needs to start happening. Bigger takeaways for the sector. So whenever we stepped into any of these rooms, we were asked, who do you represent? And various people have said in the various consultations we've had with the National Standing Committee on the Finance Parliamentary Committee and then the NCOP, why do non-profit organizations not have a single and a coherent voice that can be engaged with? So that's something for us to consider. And I mean, this is one of the positive things that's come out of this whole process, and I think we're again building towards that because we see the need for it. The other important takeaway is that our voices are heard and needed. So in all of those rooms, in all of those engagements, we were heard, and people were grateful, and they said, thank you for explaining this. We didn't know this. We didn't realize. Thank you for explaining the extent of this. So government has a problem in that it is often quite disconnected with the reality we find of what's happening on the ground. And I know other colleagues will bear me out on this. So the non-profit sector is in a position actually to be a bridge, to be a window on what's happening on the ground. And I think civil society has a really important role to play here. And in fact, the people sitting on those committees called upon us to play that role in a greater way. I think, so in all of these things, we've been reactive. The bills have come at us and we've rolled with the punches and we've got our energies together and we've done something and we've done it fast. But wouldn't it be great if we, in fact, as a whole sector, were ahead of it? If we were being proactive and we were doing this kind of work in advance. So, for instance, imagine if instead of the Treasury commissioning a risk analysis of the sector, we commissioned such a risk analysis. We will cooperate with theirs, of course, but imagine if we did our own. Imagine if instead of it coming from just government departments, there'd been, and you will see, perhaps other colleagues will share, we are now having kind of independent engagements on the various FAT forums and opportunities. So look at a place where instead of our just being reacting to what government is doing in terms of FATF recommendations, let's put our own proposals forth. I think that one of the useful things that could come out of it is if the non-profit sector put together its own kind of toolkit for risk evaluation for organizations to evaluate and report on. Those are just recent thoughts. Okay, then, sorry, time is going. The NPO Amendment Bill. So now, as in Dee's very useful slide, the green and the blue parts, we're now back away from the what's been happening with the General Laws Amendment Bill, the Octopus Bill, and back to the reissued NPO Amendment Bill. What will happen next is the changes that are in the General Laws Amendment Bill to the NPO Act will be made. So there'll be a new starting point then for the other amendments which are being proposed. We have received assurances from the NPO Directorate that submissions that were made in October 21 and the submissions made on the recent reissued exactly the same bill as the October 21 one are on record and will be referred to in producing a B version, an updated version. We've been trying to find out when the updated version will be produced and watch the space. As soon as we know, we will let you know, but we're trying to get some advance warning so that we can prepare for responses on that. So yes, I think we're in the spotlight at the moment, and because of this bill, and I think that that's something that the nonprofit sector could use as being in the spotlight, and being able to, and its voice being heard. I think on an ongoing basis, as Dia said, we need to support and keep an eye on the progress to increase the capacity of the nonprofit directorate, because that's going to be crucial. And if that breaks, that will affect all of us. And I think there's an opportunity here to drive a transition to an independent and properly capacitated nonprofit authority. A lot of our submissions have been around the inappropriateness of housing the whole of the nonprofit regulator or nonprofit registration inside of DSD, and it's being constrained by the budgets and the hiring decisions and all the sorts of things that go with being inside of DSD. And then just to build unity and broader collaboration, I think is an important takeaway. Okay, and then that's me. And thank you, Farrell, and I'm handing back at this point.
Hi, thank you very much, Nicole. To the participants, I trust that you have found it as helpful as I did, and that it is very clear to you. Some of you may be engaging with this for the first time. Certainly there's been a lot of updates since we started this, and Nicole has been very clear about what the challenges continues to be for us. But I want to pause at this moment and just ask if there are, we will allow 2 questions to Nicole, just in the interest of time. Ricardo's presentation is up next, but we'd like to ask if there is anything in the chat or if anyone requires further clarity from Nicole at this point, I will open up for 2 questions.
Video.
Yes.
There's one question from Colin Mitchell. I'm not sure if he'd like to raise it himself, but I have it here. It is, are risks of fraud and money laundering confined to monies paid out? And his second question is, would due diligence be needed for donations received? And if so, to what degree? His question is the last one on the chat at the moment.
Thank you. I'll leave to Nicole.
Yeah, I think, am I on? Yes, I am. Hi, Colin. So at the moment, so if one's looking at mandatory registration, it's only around money being spent by organizations cross-border and or spent or donated. So money. So we're looking at outflows of money and not inflows of money. So there was an initial concern with the NPO, the first draft of the NPO bill, and with the mentions of foreign organizations that there was going to be kind of policing of donors and incoming donations, but that has disappeared certainly from the Octopus bill version. That the references to foreign organizations has disappeared, and that's its focus. Of course, we'll have to engage now with the non-profit organizations bill and see to what extent any references to those sorts of things remain in that bill when we get the next version. Yeah. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Nicole. Did you cover the due diligence question? So, Colin, I think maybe I'm going to kick this down the track to another colleague later, but there's always got to be diligence on donations received, I think, but there isn't anything specific in the General Laws Amendment Bill requiring you to interrogate the source of funding. Okay, Colin, I have to park that because that is a very interesting question, and maybe Ricardo's got an answer. Okay, thank you. If there's no further questions, we'll move on to the next presentation. And thank you.
There's just one more question. You said
yes,
2,
sure,
so I'm just going on to another one. Someone's just asking, I'm not sure the name, just querying that this Amendment Act has not yet been gazetted, and we are going to be able to comment, etc., before it is gazetted.
So it's all out there. It's all been gazetted, and the commentary processes have run. The public commentary processes have run. So are we talking both the Non-Profit Organizations Amendment Bill, the previous version, and the now version? Those have both been gazetted, and the Octopus Bill was, yes, it was gazetted.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Nicole. Justin, did you say there was one more before we move on?
No, that was the second one. Peter has also responded, but I think that's not a question. It's just a response to the previous question.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. Nicole, as I said, always very succinct and clear. Appreciate. I'm now going to move to the next presentation. Okay, we're going to do the poll later. So now I would like to introduce you to another friend of the working group, Ricardo, who has been there and has helped us to unpack, and some of you may have seen his videos online, and he's always provides clarity when some of us just haven't been able to wrap our heads sometimes around some of these things. And so Ricardo today will talk to a very important aspect. So some of us working in various positions in the organizations don't always discuss these issues as they come up at board meetings, and maybe there are a few organizations who do, and of course the big topic for boards is risk. And so Ricardo is going to unpack a little bit of his insights. He told me it's not going to be a long presentation, that he's also got a very limited number of slides, but we'll see how it pans out. So Ricardo, over to you. Thank you. You want to share your presentation?
Yes, thank you, Farrell. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so just got a message here that this will stop other. Okay, there we go. Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Ricardo, we can, thank you.
just give me, Ricardo, can you just give me a second so that I can spotlight your
Just
video?
spotlight you. Oh, nice.
Okay.
Okay, you're ready to go, Ricardo. You spotlighted.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I must just express my profound appreciation for the work done by the NPO Working Group and also Nicole. I must confess that I was quite skeptical initially in terms of what could be achieved as part of this process, but I was proven wrong, and I'm happy to confess that. Yeah, so it's been quite a remarkable experience, and I think quite significant for the non-profit sector in South Africa. But well done to the working group and those that supported the work of the working group. So I have to speak on the issue of governance risks, which I must say I'm quite excited about it, and also thank you to those that are attending today. So yeah, the idea is that I want to talk just broadly about the context. I think it's important for us to have a look at the context in terms of risk. And in this context, I had the privilege of working, or at least commenting on some of the amendments that were introduced into the Financial Intelligence Center, or the Financial Intelligence Act. Those amendments were introduced in 2017, and it basically introduced what's now called a risk-based approach, which in essence required all accounting institutions in terms of that act to develop, document, maintain, and implement what's called a risk management and compliance program, RMCP. Now, for purpose of non-profits, that basically means that the banks are accountable institutions. Lawyers are also accountable institutions, so they had to comply with this particular requirement. It was actually a move away from what was called a rules-based approach. So previously, when you open a bank account, they had a list of documents that, as the non-profit organization, or any person opening a bank account, that you had to produce. Now they're saying we've abandoned the rules-based approach. Yeah, we want to. The accountable institutions must approach this on a risk-based, approach. But it also meant that for some banks, the approach is different, depending on the risk profile of the client they're dealing with. So you could have a situation where there are different rules, or not rules, but different approaches in terms of risk, which I thought was quite interesting. And I thought, at some point it's going to also impact on organizations. Now, in terms of that risk-based approach, it's basically organizations or the accountable institutions that have to identify, assess, monitor, mitigate, and manage risks. So, and that's in respect of all their clients. Now, I'm going to come back to this, but I think this is quite significant because it's a move away from rules-based to risk-based. And a lot of the accounting institutions are still grappling with this. What does it mean to have a risk-based approach? Because previously, some of them would just adopt, guidelines, and some of the guidelines were fairly straightforward. Now we actually have to apply our minds. They have to apply our minds, but it becomes increasingly relevant for non-profit organizations as well. So keep in mind, this was introduced in 2017, right? In the meantime, the Financial Intelligence Center Act issued a public compliance communication. I think that was in December 2019. If you haven't read this communication, I would strongly advise you to read it. They make recommendations, so it's not law, purely recommendations, but I think those recommendations provide us with some insight in terms of where we're heading in terms of, of a risk-based approach. Also dealing with POPIA. I mean, they make specific recommendations in terms of collecting information regarding your beneficiaries and your donors as non-profit organizations. The point I also want to make is that non-profits are now on the radar. Back in 2009, there was a proposal for compulsory registration that was avoided at that stage, but increasingly, non-profits have now been identified in terms of this particular topic. So, I mean, I would really recommend that you read this communication. Also, they have some webinar recordings on the website. Just briefly, a case study, because this risk-based approach now came up in one context in terms of money laundering or anti-money laundering. But in my view, risk or risk management is important in any case for organizations. There was a court case that actually went straight to the Supreme Court of Appeal. I wrote an article on that case in 2021 because I thought it was quite significant. That's the citation of the case. In essence, there was parents of a child that was at an ECD center wanted to hold the MEC liable for damages that incurred as a result of an accident at a playground. And in essence, the court didn't agree. And so the court, the Supreme Court of Appeal made this statement, and they said, as regards general issues of safety, including the construction and maintenance of playground equipment, the responsibility for this is that the person or organization operating the facility and the persons employed in it as teachers, carers, assistants, or ground staff, they basically have the responsibility to ensure that to address issues of safety. Now, which in my view, it's about risk management, right? So, and this deals with risk in relation to the beneficiaries of the organization. I've, for many years, advocated that even the smallest organization should have some formal approach towards risk management. And there was a bit of resistance, and I'm thinking, but look, if you're dealing with children, if you're taking care of children, then risk management should be embedded in what you do, in the organization. It doesn't have to be complicated, but you need to look at what are the risks and how to deal with the risk. And I found, the Constitutional Court basically condoned that approach, even though they recognize that organizations are having issues with resources. But I've actually found that organizations can be quite innovative when they come up with risk mitigation strategies. So this is not something that I'm advocating for. The independent code says that it advocates that the board is responsible for ensuring that due consideration is given to identify, manage, and where possible, anticipate systemic risks that may threaten the organization's sustainability. The independent code came out in 2012, and they say it should be managed in an affordable and appropriate manner. So again, it's about what's suitable for the organization. Doesn't have to be complicated, but you should have some risk management system in place. King 4 also said in terms of principles 11, the governing body should govern risk in a way that supports the organization in setting and achieving its strategic objectives. So risk, in any case, should be part of what the organization is doing, in terms of governance. In my view, that's not debatable. What has happened now is that that focus, in terms of non-profits broadly, it's the risk profile has been sort of clarified at a national level in relation to non-profit organizations. But those that have already embraced risk management, I think it would be easier for them to, the organizations to implement a suitable anti-money laundering risk management system. In terms of what's been introduced now, as I indicated, the risk profile of the nonprofit sector. And to be honest with you, I don't quite know how this is going to play out, because what I am clear on is that because of this risk-based approach on the part of accountable institutions, you're not always sure how they're going to interpret the organization and the risk profile of a particular organization, because it's a flexible approach. I think if the organization can prepare itself to minimize the perception of risk for the particular organization. But two things that I think are important that came out, and it's not quite finalized, but two themes. The one is with the NPO Act or the bill, not the proposed amendments to the NPO Act in terms of the general amendment bill, the octopus bill, as Nicole referred to it. Firstly, in terms of sharing of information, I was part of a webinar last week, and FIC was also presenting, and they made it clear, and also as part of this process, that they about collecting information, and that's not going to change, right? So they're going to collect information about NPOs. So a heads up, you need to ensure that you collect sufficient information, and I'll talk to that in a bit more. Nicole alluded to the eligibility requirements for board members, and then generally risk management. The specific information in terms of reporting obligations, in terms of how the bill stands at the moment, they're talking about the office bearers, control structure, governance, management, administration, operations. So we don't know yet precisely what that entails, because it talks about prescribed information in terms of the reporting obligations. But I can almost guarantee you that the 5-page reporting form that the NPO Directorate has used for registered organizations, that's not going to be sufficient in terms of the new dispensation. It's going to increase in terms of what information would be required from registered organizations. And part of the risk is that if it's not submitted, they might be administrative fines applicable to the organization. So this is my logo, and I'm just wrapping up. King Solomon was asked many years ago. He was given a proposition, and he was asked or told, "Ask of me anything, and I'll give it to you." And Solomon responded by saying, "Give me wisdom to govern and to lead your people, for who is able to lead this great people of yours?" In essence, his compass was focused on people. Now, if we look at all of this in terms of what's being proposed, essentially, it's about protecting people, whether it's for peer, money laundering, it's about protecting people. Now, for us, I think to a large extent, it depends on how we interpret this. Do we interpret it as another compliance burden or an opportunity to provide increased protection for the people in our organization? And I think depending on how we perceive it, it depends on, how we're going to maximize this. So if I can go back to King 4. King 4 defines the risks as it's about the uncertainty of events. So they say it's including the likelihood of such events occurring or the effect both positive and negative on the achievements of the organization's objectives. Basically, what they're saying is that there are, of course, risks have got negative implications, but there are also positive implications. There are opportunities embedded within risk management. And I think our challenge is to constantly discipline us to look at what are the opportunities. They even go further to say that the opportunities are not necessarily linked to a particular risk, but it may, in the long run, be present opportunities for the organization. And so, I'm thinking, what other opportunities for nonprofits? If you consider in your context, what are the risks, but also what are the opportunities? I think one of the challenges in the South African context is that there's a lot of non-compliance, unfortunately, right? And navigating the compliance environment is challenging. I mean, as a legal practitioner, that is the reality. But in our endeavors to comply, I think there are a lot of opportunities for organizations in South Africa, and we need to identify. I just think there's confidence that will be instilled in stakeholders if, as your organization, you can demonstrate that you've dealt with and engage with issues of compliance that you, like Nicole also indicated, that you've already, you're gearing up for an inevitability, right? And we have to ask ourselves, but why are we doing this? King Ford also talks about mindful compliance as opposed to mindless compliance, and saying that, look, we have to apply our minds in terms of, looking at, is this ultimately beneficial for our beneficiaries or for our stakeholders? Is it adding value? And in my view, a suitable risk management, system within the organization is definitely valuable. And yeah, there's so many case studies. In fact, in conclusion, exactly a month ago, there was a judgment that came out of the Western Cape High Court. And the key issue in the judgment was about risk. You know how many times the word risk or risk came up in the judgment? 21 times. And the court made a finding against the Minister of Justice and Correctional Services. But there was a lot of focus on risk. And I think risk is with us. The sooner we can get to grips with risk management, the better. And I think it presents an enormous opportunity for our organizations. Thank you.
Ricardo, thank you very much. Quite a lot for the sector to think about, certainly the participants who is on this call today. I know that the issue of risk management doesn't always take up a lot of time when we talk about it, and so you've just brought it into scope. It's absolutely important and critical that we talk about it in a much bigger and a much broader way. I mean, even beyond the boardroom. So a lot for us to think about. Thanks, Ricardo. I want to just ask if Jocelyn, if there are any questions for Ricardo, questions of clarity needed, even comments.
I don't know.
Anything?
No questions at this stage, Firio.
Okay, which means Ricardo's done a good job, right? Thank you. All right, thank you very much, Ricardo. So I'm going to move on to the next presentation and then just say that the poll we were going to do, we're going to do at the end so that we allow all the presenters to get in what they came to share with us today. So again, thank you very much, Ricardo. I'm just going to put the presentation back on the screen. And so now the next person that I would like to introduce is another friend of Inyatelo in this case, I would say. I'm pretty sure of the sector as well, because Fatima Shabudin, who is currently the strategy director at the Wraith Foundation, has been working in the development sector for, as I understand it, roughly around 25 or so years. She's an individual who is very well traveled. She's worked abroad. She's worked in South Africa, in the United Kingdom, in Indonesia, in Ethiopia, and in the US. And she has also worked and has served on boards of 2 social justice organizations, and I think quite understand the challenges that we are facing as a nonprofit sector. But what she's going to talk to us about today is to give us her perspectives on how this amendments of the various bills impact on grant makers, and ultimately, in her view, how it impacts on the sector. Fatima, if you can turn on your screen. Thank you for joining us. Oh, you are there already. Thanks. I'll turn off my screen. Big welcome to you.
Thank you, Nyatalo, for the opportunity to share some reflections. It's wonderful to be in this space, seeing so many old comrades here. I think I haven't seen Ricardo for at least a decade. And I think Ferial revealed my age here by saying how long I've been in the sector. But I've been around the block, and so what I do want to do is I've listened to the presentations and I want to say thank you because I haven't been involved in the Inyatalo process. I followed this NPO Act developments online, reading and so on, and received a very good briefing from Media Monitoring Africa a week ago. So that was quite useful. I'm not the technical person, so what I do want to do, the framing for my input and my reflection is the politics of this act. So please bear with me because I think it's a bit of a changing of gear through this. So I do think the first thing that is useful is to look at the act through an historical perspective and to look at what the act was originally supposed to do. So I was quite surprised when I did the research and found that when it was promulgated in 1997, the objective of the act is to create an enabling environment in which NPOs can flourish. And surprisingly, the last part of that objective is that government is to promote, support, and enhance the capacity of NPOs to perform their functions. And I think anybody who's been in the sector will know that there's very little of that second part happening. So I do think what we need to do in terms of framing is there is a tension between the constitutional, so basically we've got the constitution and all of us, I think, support the constitution. And in the South African constitution, there's no area that's outside of the constitution, not even the NPO sector. So if you talk to women's rights organizations now, there's actually a push to regulate churches because we know the harm that it's done, women in particular. So the question I'm asking us to be self-critical is why should the NGO sector be exempted from a requirement that we see as good for everybody else? So, and so that's the first point of reflection. And the tension is between that constitutional provision, which is all-encompassing, and the fact that the notion of compulsory registration is at odds with international law. So I do think part of what we need to do as a starting point is to figure out how we manage that tension. So when we look at it, I do think part of another complicating factor is the fact that the nature of the engagement has changed significantly since Treasury has started this parallel process. And when I hear the discussions about FATF, I'm shocked at the lack of politics in that conversation, that we accept as a given the fact that these are the regulations coming our way. And there's very little questioning of this anti-terrorism agenda, which is highly problematic for a whole host of reasons. And when I didn't know the FATF until recently, until these things happened. And when I read up on it, it's a G7 structure. And for those of you who don't know, the G7 is a representation of all the rich countries in the world, and we know that there's always an agenda, there's political biases. So the question is, we have, as a very small player in the global scene, of course, South Africa cannot push back against this because we will be grey listed, and we know that we will be severely affected as a sector. But I'm still surprised at the silence on the politics of how this thing is unfolding. So in reading the critique so far, there's basically three categorizations. The first one has been procedural, and the process through which this act is being rewritten. And I think the reality is there's no law reform that has taken place in our country in the last decade at least, where there wasn't a problem with the process. So objectively in our country, something has gone wrong with the participatory process or intentions of lawmaking, and there's no legislative engagement where the timeline has been respectful, transparent, realistic, and so on. So I think in the process of the NPO Act, we can either see it as a conspiracy, something to undermine us, or recognize that there's a broader dysfunctionality in the state and that this is another manifestation of it. The other part of the objections have been logistical, and I think many of the speakers today have talked about it, the lack of capacity in the NPO Directorate and DST, just the fact that if this act goes through as it is, this directorate does not have the capacity to do what the act would require them to do. So I do think the political part of that conversation is recognizing that the NPO, the directorate, has historically been under-resourced, and that is not a coincidence. because it is about the political value that's being attached to the sector. And I'm going to come back to that. So it's the procedural issues, it's the administrative or the logistical issues about what happens practically. And the last part of it is the politics of the act. And that is where I want to focus. So one of the things I think is, it is useful for us to look around the world and especially look in our region and see what has happened in instances where the NPO Act has been revised and the political consequences, which have been quite devastating to NPO sectors and the rest of the continent. So if we look at Rwanda, if we look at Ethiopia, in Ethiopia, I know people woke up one morning and half of the NGOs in the sector were deregistered because the NPO Act provision contained a clause that basically stipulated that if more than half of your income comes from abroad, then you're not considered a local NGO. So I think things like that are of particular concern because we know that the majority of NGOs in our country run off international funding. There's very little money coming from inside the country, and that's a conversation point. So I think part of the issue, and more recently, the Zimbabwean Act. So we've seen that across the continent, where these acts have been rewritten, not with great process, the consequences for the sector have been devastating. So I must say, when I spoke with someone in government, a senior person about this, is the NGOs is so paranoid. And I said, we have reason to be paranoid because these things don't happen in a vacuum. We see what's happening just across the board. And also, very specifically, there's been a particular unfolding of our relationship with the state over time. So I do think part of what we need to recognize is that the nature of the relationship between the sector and the state has not been a consistent and stagnant one. It has evolved over time. And I think now in our memories, we remember the Zuma era as the turning point where NGOs were blatantly labeled as, I don't know, handmaidens of the imperialists or regime change agents. But the truth is that we had a honeymoon period under the Madiba administration because there was very active cooperation for many reasons. We were excited about our new constitution. There weren't really warning signs in government at the extreme level, and our working relationship was well. But basically, since the Mbeki era, there's been a deterioration of our relationship with the ruling party, in particular in government more broadly over time. So I do think one of the opportunities of this moment is for us to go and have that conversation with government to say, how do you see the sector? Do you see the value of what we offer the country? And if you do that, then the nature of the engagement and the orientation would be very different to what it is now. But part of our challenge is, of course, our lack of coordination and the lack of effort to initiate that, because by and large, the efforts on the part of the sector has been us on the back foot. We respond to government's initiatives just as we are doing now. So, of course, based on the experiences of other countries, we can see the potential for politically motivated abuse of compulsory registration is significant. And I think in the South African context, especially where we know, it's been confirmed that at a certain point, the security agencies were spying on the right to know, were spying on fees must fall. So we know our state has the capacity already and have exercised that capacity to restrict civil society in some way. So, and I think that this development is also happening along a perceived shrinkage of civil space in our country. So we see these activist persecutions, the number of Abashlali leaders that have been killed. We've seen incidents of spying on NGOs by the state, and we've also seen things like slap suits that increasingly, so it's not only the state that's lashing back at the civil society, there's also a significant backlash from the corporate sector. So as an NGO sector, I think for decades, our preoccupation has been the state, which it rightly should be because the state is the duty bearers. No, it's their responsibility to deliver certain rights to us. But in that focus, in that singular focus, we blind ourselves to the fact that in our country, business is almost more powerful than government. And the decisions ShopRite makes about the prices we pay for bread, how little they pay their workers as devastating an impact as government. So we see a number of slap suits evolving, where especially mining houses and around environmental circles, companies are actively pursuing activists for the things that we say, whether it's in a public platform or in a meeting. And of course, activists don't have the money to stay tied up in courts forever. But there are these red flags which I think we should take heed of. Recently, CERI, the Centre of Environmental Rights, no, I've got the acronym down, but it's CERI, was under threat from Operation Dudula because of the anti-xenophobia work they're doing and the support to the refugee individuals in our country. We've also seen journalists being threatened. So I think the framework of this conversation is that we've known that in the region this is happening, that there's a clampdown on space for us to operate. And that for a long time, I think South Africa was above that. By and large, we had the space to do what we wanted to do. But I do think there's red flags that things have changed or are starting to change, and that we should sit up and take note and decide what we want to do about it. So I think where CSOs have been dependent mainly on international funding, this rendered us particularly vulnerable to accusations of furthering foreign interests. And we know that this is not unique to South Africa. All around the world, civil society organizations, by and large, draw the resources they need to do their work from abroad. The challenge with South Africa, and it is in the context of, I think, the unfolding funding crisis in the sector. I've been in the sector for however many years. There's never been a time where I haven't heard people say there's a funding crisis. But I do think objectively, if we look at what the funding focus areas of donors are, the number of donors leaving or planning to leave, there's obviously a shrinking of resources available to the sector, which poses a big threat. And when we talk to international agencies, of course, we know the line. This is a middle income country. In fact, South Africa is quite a rich country, especially compared to other African countries. And the reality is that the pressure is on us to find ways of unlocking resources in the country. And I'm not talking about the bilaterals where we talk to corporations individually and try and get some of the corporate social responsibility money. I do think the moment is here where we have to start turning to corporate South Africa and say, to make a business case for human rights, to basically convince them that it's in their interest that we have a transformative, stable society. And, we have to make an argument basically in bottom line cases to say it's going to be profitable for you. And I do think that the business sector understands that, because during the Zuma Must Fall campaign, there was an influx of money from the corporate sector because they realized at that moment that, a politically unstable country is not good for business. So I think the ideological subtext of the engagement is, in our engagement with the state, there's a constant questioning of the legitimacy of civil society organizations. And part of what we are asked repeatedly, and I'm sure if you've engaged government, you've heard it too, they ask who have elected you, who are you accountable to? And I think these are important, crucial questions for us to grapple with, because we have to, as a sector, figure out how we evidence our legitimacy and accountability and push back against the notion that you are only a legitimate expression of democracy if you are elected. So I do think part of what we need to repeat is the fact that we can have legitimate expressions of civil society where there isn't an election involved. But that kind of argument does presuppose that we put in place efforts to clean house. So I think part of the honesty that the moment required is to say that there is a question around legitimacy. There is a problem with sexual harassment in the sector. There is a problem with people putting their husbands and children on the boards of the organizations, because I think in the end, when a crisis unfolds, when people steal money in organizations, the people who look at civil society critically don't distinguish. They don't say there's a funding crisis at SJI. They say these NGOs are stealing money. They don't say there's this one organization where someone has put their husband on the board. They say the NGOs operate like this. So I do think part of what will strengthen our hand in engaging in the politics of what's happening is a very, I think, a sincere and strong effort for us to look at what weakens us as a collective and what we need to put in place independent of the state. Because I think the other thing to bear in mind is the state has this process now. A year or two from now, they'll embark on another process. And we can't use these as catalysts for us to self-organize. We've known for a long time that one of the big challenges of sector is the lack of coordination or an overarching campaign that holds us all together. Because as much as we accuse the sector of governments of operating in silos, there's a complete silo approach to how we do things as well. You know, housing organizations are focused on housing, women look at GBV and so on. And we know that the people that we work for, the people that we claim to work for, don't live single issue lives. It's multiple dimensions, yet the way we operate, you know, we structure ourselves in those thematic pillars, and then it undermines our strength. So for me, I think the argument that we have to make is the reality is that our constitution presupposes the existence of a very strong civil society sector to counterbalance the potential totalizing power of the state. And so politically, I think that is what we need to, that's the conversation we need to have with government, and we need to get them to agree that this is the value of civil society. I think part of our challenge is it's a profiling crisis, the fact that we're not communicating well and claiming our victories. So if you look at the COVID crisis and the lockdown, and the reality is it was civil society's response that kept people alive. And particularly it was Black working class women's efforts, who prevented many people from starving during that moment. Yet at the end of the COVID crisis, there's not a confirmation of civil society's value and its contribution played. And we are very, maybe too modest to say that, but and then again, if you look at the State Capture Commission, it's very clear that civil society were the canaries in the mines. We were the ones who said for a long time, there's something wrong here. And for those efforts, for the initial courage that organizations, that the Amapunganis and so took to do the call out, there was significant backlash. But then at the end now, we've gone through a process, and there is broad consensus that there was a state capture project, and the fact that some people are being prosecuted now is the evidence of that. But we haven't yet, as a sector, stepped forward and claimed that. So part of the issue is that, I'm supposed to speak for the donors. Let me say, take it out of your suspense. The first thing, there has been no donor response to this. I think donors have to date individually grappled with what the NPO Act means for them, but there hasn't been a coordinated response. And part of it is because the donors are all themselves differently located. Some of them, like RAID, it's a completely South African foundation. The money comes from South Africa, the board is South African, and so our ability to respond and engage, and the impact of the NPO Act will probably affect us as it affects other local organizations, the grantees that we fund. And so our positionality in relation to the Act and the impact for us is different. I think, and I don't want to speak with international donors, but I do think for international donors, generally, there is a reluctance to get involved in the politics, because remember, they are here as guests of government. And so it also limits their ability to critically respond to development. There is a social justice donor meeting plan for upcoming Tuesday, where this matter will be on the agenda. And if there's something that evolves, comes out of it, I would be happy to report back on that. But I'm actually not sure if there will be a coordinated response out of that. We'll know by Tuesday. So I think the other point to note is that this NPO Rewrite Act, as I mentioned, it happened in the region, but it's also happening all over the world because of the grey listing factors. So the Institute for Development Studies at Sussex University in the UK did a study on our donors have responded, particularly to NPO Rewrite Acts and shrinking spaces, and there's been ABCDE 5 primary responses. The first thing is that they have started documenting and analyzing the issue of human rights defenders and using their voices as donors to profile incidents of violations. Some donors have made operational adaptations where they operate from more remote locations. So I'm aware that some of the Zimbabwe comrades, NGOs were funded out of South Africa. They weren't donors who had offices there anymore, but they still figured out a way to fund those organizations. Number 3 was that donors have invested more in tracking civil society space and risk analysis. I think sometimes we've talked about here. So I do think part of what the moment represents the opportunity is for civil society to step back and to say, regardless of this act, or as we engage with this act, what is it that we need to do to coordinate and to be, put arrangements in place for us to be more impactful as a sector. And then, of course, the donors across the board have provided emergency funds for human rights defenders where these have been in danger, and for funding SLAP suits, which is one of the things Rate has done as well. So I think there is a need to be for the donors to define their response to the act in conversation with the civil society organizations, so that our effort and the fact that donors come to the table with power and the government doesn't listen to us in a different way. So I do think it's important for our efforts, those of the organizations that we fund and of the donors, to reinforce each other. So to my knowledge, there hasn't been a structured conversation between the NPO working group and the donors, and I think that would be a good next step. I think the last 2 points I want to make is I think it's important for us, when I looked at the NPO working group, I was also struck by the fact that it looks like, and I'm not familiar with all the organizations, but it looks like a lot of those are service organizations. And I do think it's useful for us to distinguish between organizations who provide services where the state isn't capable of doing so. No, those are the organizations who respond to the manifestations of the crisis, whether it's hunger or shelters or children's rights and so on. But basically, if you consider that the state is obligated to provide certain services, and in many cases, not able to, not willing to, but there's a vacuum, and into that vacuum stuck a number of civil society organizations. So if I take a look at women's shelters, you know, that is a function that the state is supposed to provide, but the NGOs step into those kind of service organizations are differently, have a different relationship to the organizations, civil society organizations, social justice organizations who are more focused on targeting the structural drivers of the problem. So social justice organizations who advocate, in essence, the target is primarily the state, and so they have a dependent relationship with them, need the money of the state to operate. There are service organizations. So I think part of what we need to do is evidence a kind of a level of self-awareness about the sector, because it's not one homogeneous mix, and how the act means different things to different people in the sector. And so I think the last thing I want to say is, when I listen to everything I've read, I think there's obviously a dire need for the sector to strategize and to coordinate. We know that one of the big weaknesses in the sector is coordination and lack of kind of overall strategy that holds us together. So I don't know if there is awareness of the Social Justice Assembly. So there is a collective of social justice organizations who are planning a Social Justice Assembly for the 26th and the 27th of January. It will take place in Johannesburg. And there is a website called socialjusticeassembly.org.za. Encourage people to register, to get in there, because I think that would be an convening space to further discuss the act, support mission and safety. And I think on that note, I will say thank you. Close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fatima. That was extremely insightful. You raised some very pertinent issues that I'm pretty sure those listening could relate to. You know, you speak about the politics of the act. You've also brought some of the Pan-African perspectives. I love the examples that you gave about Ethiopia and Zimbabwe, and I don't think the working group have quite done any sort of benchmarking in terms of what's going on, you know, in the rest of the continent per se. And then you spoke about the relationship between state and the sector. Yeah, so bar for a few one-on-one relationships has been very helpful to the NPO working group. Yeah, we can certainly, we feel that at most of the time. And then when you spoke about how the vulnerability of CSO, the lack of perceived lack of coordination, and maybe it's real. Just recently, we attended the Unmute conference led by Kagiso, and where there's a beginning of the bubbling of some sort of movement that, could emerge to bring about some sort of coordination and hopefully a response to some of the issues that the sector is dealing with beyond the amendment bill, and of course, including all the amendments of the various acts. So, so I appreciate the encouragement that you gave to the working group, and you again brought into scope the notion of the value of the nonprofit sector and how we're constantly having to deal with all the issues that you actually forget, because you're constantly dealing with issues. And it sometimes is just absolutely disgusting that we constantly have to make a case for the values that we bring. And I think it's tiring, at best, it's extremely tiring. But I want to just end my comments there and ask if there's anyone who wishes to pose a question to Fatima while we've got her here. As I must say, when I got Fatima on board, she was kind of half packing a suitcase to go somewhere a couple of days ago. And wow, and then she flew back and said, no, I'll be there. So that was really great while she was packing. So thank you, Fatima. Any questions for Fatima? Justin, any comments there? Anything we have to deal with?
Phil, no direct question to Fatima. I don't know, during the Q&A session, we might want to raise the due diligence question again for all the presenters to respond to.
Okay. Can you just, Fatima, thank you very much. Famada has a hand up. Famada, anything from you?
Okay, thank you so much. It's been such an enlightening presentation to hear Fatima speak. And I think, I agree, we do, to your point as well, we get caught up in dealing with one crisis after the other, that sometimes we need a reminder that the foundation of the nonprofits is based on the notion of social justice. So my question really is about how do we build capacity within the nonprofit sector to encourage a reflection on the foundations of what we're doing? Because when I look at, like, for example, new staff coming into the nonprofit space, everyone is caught up in the act of doing and responding to crises, that we really don't have sufficient space for reflection and thought. And I'd be interested to hear what are some of the things we could do to bring it back. I mean, this kind of engagement obviously is very useful, but how do we amplify impact moving forward?
Was that question for me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's a very important question. So I do think because I've been around in the sector for as long as I have, I do think the sector politically has weakened over time because of, I think, a negligence of political education. So when I engage with maybe a housing rights organization, if you talk to people, there's quite an in-depth understanding of housing question. Housing policies, what's happening in government, what the state of housing rights are, but there is a lack of making the linkage with overall frameworks. Because as I said, our organizational themes is one thing, but no one is one issue. So the woman that we want to get a house for is probably the same woman who is unemployed, or struggling with gender-based violence and so on. So my experience, one of our biggest failures is the lack of interconnection of our struggles. So of course, in the anti-apartheid era, it was easy. We had a singular focus, we had a singular goal that connected all of us, that allowed us to construct the political framing for it. So I do think part of what is missing at this moment is that. So I am hoping that the Social Justice Assembly, that one of the conversation points is, what is it that holds all of us together? Is it the fact that we're the most unequal country in the world? Is it poverty? What is it that we want to, as a collective, regardless of what you are working on, that we want to bring together? And then if that is an agreement or a negotiation, then it does mean individually as organizations, we need to then make effort to do internal education of our own staff and our own constituencies. because we won't develop that understanding just by declaring our intention or our commitment to it. We actually have to give it work and time. And political education sounds more complicated than it is. It literally, it's also setting up reading groups between organizations, regularly meeting to make sense of things, because also we are living in a very fast unfolding world. So our strategies are only as effective as it is, and all things have changed in our world so dramatically, and in our country. I mean, today is a completely different day in South Africa because of that pala information that's out there. We're still reading and trying to figure out what does it mean for the next month, for the ANC conference, for the next elections. So I'm saying, if we fail to constantly do that analysis, which I think we see as an indulgence or a luxury, then it does question, it doesn't have our ability to be impactful, strategic in our work. And as I'm saying, as I said in my input, is one of our weaknesses is that we fail to initiate coordination, this kind of conversation, unless government does something. So we are critical of government, and we don't want to be completely government orientated. But in the end, if you look at our moments of response, it is when government calls the summit. I'm saying part of what we need to do is also to own our space as independent agents. We've got agency, and we can do this conversation convening, not in government's timeline, because part of the, the complication of this NPO Act is you don't know when the next deadline is going to be or how it's going to unfold. So if we in this conversation recognize that coordination and strategy is a problem, we shouldn't have to wait for the NPO Act to unfold its process. But of course, the question is, do we have that bigger commitment to get the sector in order? But we will give it our time. So that should Thank you.
Hamada, I trust you enjoyed Fatima's response. All right, thank you. Thanks, Fatima. Anyone else have a question for Fatima? Jocelyn, nothing? Okay, folks, we're coming up a few minutes before 12 o'clock. We really only booked your time until 12 o'clock. I would have liked to do a poll and share some of the results, but I am absolutely respectful of your time. So if you wish to participate in the poll, we're just quickly going to put it on the screen. The information that was shared this morning will be on our website. We're going to send a link to the website so that you can go and revisit the presentations. The recording of this 2-hour session will also be on the website. You can reflect and share broadly if you wish. But I would like now to just do the poll. If I can just get my colleague Bayanda to put it on for us. It'll take a couple of minutes. It is absolutely important that we begin to map who we are representing. And so one of the questions in that poll is really talking about whether you would give us permission to represent you. What information do you have? What knowledge do you have about all the discussions that went on this morning prior to when you came in? And of course, you're now more knowledgeable. And so we would really like just to gather that information. As often some of our presenters will tell you, or Nicole specifically, is we're often asked, who do you represent? And so we've got a whole long list of people who attend, but we don't often have more information of the kinds of organizations that they represent. And I want to assure you that we're completely compliant with the POPIA Act, so the information is not being sold to anyone, is not being provided for others to communicate any kind of marketing with you. In fact, it's not even shared amongst the members, so it's just kept intact. We would appreciate you just completing that little poll. Bayanda, is the poll on? We don't have a lot of time. Okay, it says
Farrell, you muted?
so interesting when they control you, the engineers control you in the background. They decide when you may talk, when your screen is on, when your screen is off. So I did not unmute myself, Suzanne. I mean, I know a few have had to attend to other meetings, and I know, you know, when we planned, it's always so difficult. You want to share, you've got the opportunity to talk to a group of people, and you want to share as much as you can, and then you have to recognize that you can't take out so much time in the day. If once we have your attention, it's always good to share as much as we can, right? Okay. Oh.
All right, Farrell, we're almost done on our side. If everybody is ready, then we can end the poll.
Thank you.
Just a second. We still have a couple of folks answering.
Thank you. Thank you, Fatima. Before you go, we just want to thank you very much again. We do look forward to engaging with you a little bit more. You have made a comment about the NPO Working Group possibly have to engage with the donor community. And so if you don't mind, we will make contact with you to see how that is possible. And your guidance and leadership on that would be tremendously of value to us. Thank you very much for joining us.
There we go.
Okay, how are we doing?
All right, we still have folks answering our poll.
Okay.
I think I'm going to give it another couple of seconds and then we can end.
Can you put it on the screen?
Will do. Here we go. There we go.
It's not on my screen. Okay, is anyone seeing the results on the screen?
Yes.
Yes, folks, you should
Is
be able
that
to.
Soraya?
Yes, we can see them, or
Soraya,
some of them.
there's some technical glitch on my end, so I can't see the results. So I don't want to take up anybody's time. Do you mind talking to the results? Just in terms of the questions and what you are seeing there, I'm really not able to see it.
I can just see the first question that says, rate your level of knowledge and understanding regarding the NPO Amendment Bill. And you can see there, close to half have said at a rate of 3 to 4 in terms of understanding what's going on. It would have been interesting to do the poll at the beginning and at the end. Perhaps that would have had an effect too. There is still, only 11% fully understand what's going on. So there's room, I do believe, for further education as well around it and ongoing. I can only see that first question from my end.
You just need to scroll down today, huh?
Is it? Okay. Okay, question 2, rate the level of understanding of your board members with regards to the implications if the laws are passed. No understanding, 14%, at level 1, 25%, level 2, 16%, and about 3 on average, 32%. So most people feel there's some sort of level of understanding at an average of 3, and then 9 and 5% for level 4 and fully understanding. And then question 3, place in order of importance your need to know of the proposed law, 1 being the most important. How do we interpret this now? It looks like the most important need at the moment is A, governance risks for my NGO. Second would be, if I'm reading this correctly, or sorry, am I reading this correctly? There's a level of 1 to 4.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are. You're
And
doing
then,
good.
okay, and then B looks like fundraising implications. And then the next one would be compliance implications for my NPO. And then lastly, other. And then the last question is, if you chose other in the previous section, please explain your answer. And we don't have the narrative here. Perhaps that shows up in a different way. This is just showing the statistics, yeah.
Yeah, that'll be different answers for different people. As the same with number 5. Also different answers for different participants.
And we'll record those, right, Jacques, and keep them.
Yes, we
on
are
file.
recording them. Yes, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah, Soraya, thank you very much. That's extremely helpful. It's good information for us to build onto, and for all of those who participated, it's very, very kind of you that you actually stayed on to be able to give us this data that we can now build onto. So we're at the point where we'd like to just thank everyone. I want to say you guys have been, I mean, I think we started off with 165 and then went up to 168 as I was following, and maybe close to 170. And then after an hour and a half, it kind of gradually dropped off, which I could understand, you know, clearly as the people now needed to get back to their meetings. But in the main, just for having been here and spent the time with us so that we could help you to increase your knowledge about these important issues. That's been absolutely amazing. So, so thank you very much on behalf of the working group for your time and your input. The NPO Working Group, as you've heard from members who presented, we are committed to do what Dee spoke about in her presentation in the first segment of the sessions. She said we will keep monitoring and campaigning for action. We will keep talking to FATF, Treasury, FIC, SARS, and the European Union Global at-risk NPOs. She said we will keep raising awareness through the media, coalitions, and partnership, and we will keep asking questions. And so it will continue to be important for us then to keep going. And also we need your help. We need to get the word out. We need you to spread the messages. If there's next public meeting being set up, if you could please share it as widely as you possibly can. It is absolutely important that the sector, as you've heard, that was the report that Soraya shared with you, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So thank you from all of us. Have a fabulous day. And then I want to close off by saying, we wish you well, hamba gashle, assalamu alaikum, lekker dag verder, sale gashle, and just have an awesome day. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
To our two, I'm sorry, I mustn't miss out. Our two amazing interpreters who stayed with us for 2 hours, Caitlin and Nomsa, you've been fantastic. Thank you. Through this, we now can share to a much broader audience. And then, of course, you know, the issue of diversity that should be top of mind, we're addressing that by making sure that those who are unable to hear us can now actually see and understand the issues that we've been talking about. So Nomsa and Caitlin and Deaf South Africa, thank you.
Okay.